Welcome to this month in RAD Studio for May 2019. I'm Malcolm Groves from Code Partners. So in this month's news, first up I'd like to talk about the updated roadmap that Embarcadero have published for RAD Studio, which includes Delphi and C Builder obviously. There's a bunch of information in there. There's links in the show notes underneath to some overviews and also a deep dive post that the product managers have made. But a few highlights in there for me. They mentioned that the 10.3.2 update is already in beta now. If you're an update subscription customer, you should have already received an invitation to that. If you haven't, there's some details in there in the articles on how to get that invitation. But that's already in beta. Major things that it's covering is Mac OS 64-bit support for Delphi. If you've been getting the warnings when you're running your Mac applications about it not being optimized for this system, that will deal with that little issue. Also Interbase 64-bit support. In addition, Windows 64-bit support for C++ 17. So if you're a C++ builder user, that'll be welcome. And also a bunch of RTL runtime library performance improvements. They started on some of these in the earlier 10.3.1 release, but there's a bunch more coming for 10.3.2, which is kind of good news because general RTL improvements tend to help everybody. It doesn't matter what sort of application you're building, improvements to the runtime help pretty much everybody. The articles also go on to talk about the next major version, which is RAD Studio 10.4. No knowledge yet on what the city name will be. The big things in here, there's a bunch of information in the articles, but a couple of the things in here there that stand out for me. One is obviously the Android 64-bit support for Delphi. Google have announced that there'll be restrictions on applications that they're accepting into the App Store. So that 64-bit support is welcome. Also some more information about high DPI style support for the VCL. That will obviously cover your VCL applications, but also the IDE itself, given that it's a VCL application. And also, the interesting one for me was the LSP, the Language Server Protocol support, which they started to introduce for C++ Builder in an earlier release. They've mentioned in there that they're taking that to Delphi. Why should you care about this? I think the main reason that most people should care about this is that it's probably the first chance where they've done a major revamp on how Code Insight and a lot of the IDE parsing support works. And so I think there's an opportunity in there to fix a whole bunch of issues that have been slowly building up over the years, things like error insight and pausing of the IDE while it parses particularly big source files. So I'm quite hopeful that that LSP support will resolve some of those issues. I guess the big question in this is timing. In the articles they do talk about timing for these releases. They're talking about Northern Hemisphere summer, which is down here in Australia, which is our winter, and it's quite cold today, so I'm hoping that sort of tells me that we're pretty close to winter. When in winter, I don't know, but obviously, again, if you're a update subscription customer, I'm sure at some point there'll be an invitation going out for the 10.4 beta. Yeah. Moving on from the roadmap, also this month there's been an announcement for C++ Builder users about support for Boost. If you go to the link in the show notes, there's details about different versions. Win32. What version of the compiler you're using, what version of Boost it's been updated to. Too much for me to remember, but go there and have a look. But basically they've updated the Boost support pretty much across the board in C++ Builder, but probably more importantly, or just as importantly, they've made the pledge that from 10.3.2 onwards, so the update that's in beta at the moment, From 10.3.2 onwards, they're pledging to have same day or very close to same day support for Boost for the new versions. Yeah, so there was a long delay in the current version. They've put the procedures in place to make sure that they can roll out updates for Boost support pretty much as soon as we get a new version of C++ Builder, so that's great. What else? A bunch of RAD Server activity. Covering all sorts of things. We've had a fantastic webinar from David I. It's great to see David I back around these tools. We had a great webinar from David I on RAD Server. If you've been wondering about RAD Server, what it is, how do I get started, it's really good. It takes you right from the beginning all the way through to actually deploying stuff. So there's that webinar replay you can go and watch. David's also written a book on RAD Server, which there's again links to in the show notes. That's also available for free for enterprise and architect customers. So if you have RAD Studio or Delphi or C Builder Enterprise or Architect, you can go and download David's RAD Server book as well. But in addition, there's links in there to Kari Jensen webinar and white paper on RAD Server, and a bunch of articles. David and a few other people are writing a series of articles on doing different things in RAD Server. So a bunch of activity and momentum around RAD Server. Following on from last month when I talked about some of the updates to the RAD Server dashboard. And if you go and have a look in the roadmap, there's further updates around RAD Server. So that plus all of this material that's started coming out in the last month seems to show a lot of activity and a lot of momentum around RAD Server. Yeah. Lastly, trying to keep this short this month. Lastly, if I can be bold enough, we also published an article just last week on RAD Server licensing. Now, on the surface, that may not sound terribly interesting, I get that. It's not probably the first thing I'd rush to read either. But in the light of some recent announcements from Embarcadero about changes in their registration policies, that's kind of what prompted us to finally write this. We'd been thinking about writing it for a while. But really the gist of the article is to explain that there are multiple options actually when you come to licensing your RAD Studio product. Most people, 90+% of people, just go with named user licenses, but in fact there's a bunch of other choices that you have, and some of them give you much more flexibility when it comes to actually managing your licenses. Yeah, who your licenses are allocated to, how much dependency you have on Embarcadero for being able to move those licenses between people. When someone leaves, how you can get those licenses back. So if you're interested in having more control, local control over your RAD Studio licensing, check out that article. Okay, again, links in the show notes. Okay, that's it for this month. I tried to, as I said, tried to keep it a bit shorter this month. You'll see in the notes below links to how you can get notified when there's a new episode, when we have other articles published, those sorts of things. So follow those, subscribe here in YouTube if you want to get notified for the next video. Otherwise, have a fantastic month and talk to you soon. Cheers.